The housemaid heard the millionaire's daughter crying every night. One night, she snuck into the girl's room and was horrified to see what the girl's father was doing. The sun had barely risen when Clara opened her eyes, awakened by the shrill sound of her alarm clock. She blinked a few times, adjusting to the dim light in the small maid's room at the Johnson mansion. The air was cold, and she could see her breath forming small clouds in the air. Another day, she thought, rubbing the sleep from her eyes. Another day of endless work. Clara got up, her bare feet touching the cold floor. She shivered, quickly putting on the worn slippers she kept by the bed. She headed to the small attached bathroom, where she washed and dressed in the gray and white uniform that had been her second skin for so many years. Looking at herself in the stained mirror, Clara saw the face of a 35-year-old woman, brown hair tied in a severe bun, hazel eyes tired but still alert. Fine lines had begun to form around her eyes and mouth, silent witnesses to years of hard work. When did I age so much? She wondered, running her fingers over the marks on her face. It seems like just yesterday that I arrived here, young and full of hopes. Shaking her head to dispel these thoughts, Clara left the room and descended the service stairs. The mansion was still quiet, the Johnson family members still sleeping in their luxurious rooms. In the immaculate kitchen, Clara began her daily routine. She prepared the elaborate breakfast that Mr. Johnson demanded every morning: eggs Benedict, artisanal toast, freshly squeezed orange juice, and freshly ground Colombian coffee. The smell of coffee filled the kitchen, rich and comforting. Clara took a deep breath, allowing herself a moment of pleasure before continuing her work. At exactly 7:30 a.m., she went upstairs with the breakfast tray. She knocked gently on the master bedroom door. "Come in," came Mr. Johnson's deep voice. Clara opened the door, entering the sumptuous room. Mr. Johnson, a middle-aged man with graying hair and eyes as cold as steel, was sitting on the king-size bed, a laptop open in front of him. "Good morning, sir," Clara said, her voice neutral and professional. "Your breakfast." Johnson barely glanced at her, waving distractedly at the bedside table. "Put it there," he said, his eyes fixed on the computer screen. Clara obeyed silently, placing the tray on the table. She could smell Mr. Johnson's expensive cologne mixed with the scent of freshly laundered sheets. It was a strange contrast to the comforting aroma of coffee and toast. "Do I need to remind you that Mrs. Johnson returns from her trip tonight?" Johnson said, finally looking at Clara. His eyes were cold and calculating, making Clara feel as if she were being assessed. "No, sir," she replied promptly. "I have already arranged for her room to be cleaned and will prepare her favorite dinner for tonight." Johnson nodded, apparently satisfied. "Good. You may go." Clara gave a small bow and left the room, closing the door quietly behind her. Only then did she allow her shoulders to relax, letting out a silent sigh. "Sometimes I wonder if he even sees me as a human being," she thought as she descended the stairs. To him, I'm just another cog in his perfectly oiled machine. The rest of the day passed in a blur of tasks: cleaning, washing, ironing, cooking. Clara moved through the mansion like a ghost, efficient and almost invisible. The other servants, the butler, the gardener, the driver, barely exchanged a few words with her, all absorbed in their own responsibilities. By the time night fell, Clara was exhausted. Her feet ached, her back throbbed, and she longed for nothing more than to lie down in her narrow bed. She was finishing organizing the laundry when she heard it, a low sound, almost imperceptible, coming from upstairs. Clara paused, tilting her head to listen better. There it was again, a muffled sob filled with pain and despair. Clara frowned, her heart quickening. The sound was coming from Emily's room, Mr. Johnson's daughter. It wasn't the first time she had heard these nighttime cries, but they had never been so intense, so anguished. "It's none of my business," she told herself, returning to folding the sheets. "I shouldn't meddle in the family's affairs." But as the minutes passed, the sobs continued, growing more desperate. Clara felt her chest tighten, a sense of unease growing inside her. Finally, unable to bear it any longer, she placed the last folded sheet in the closet and left the laundry room. The hallway was dark, illuminated only by the moonlight streaming through the high windows. Clara walked quietly towards Emily's room, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew she was taking a risk, that she could be reprimanded, or worse, for interfering. But something inside her, a compassion that years of service hadn't been able to extinguish completely, drove her forward. Reaching Emily's door, Clara hesitated. The sobs were more audible now, interspersed with gasping breaths that made Clara's heart ache. "What am I doing?" she thought, her hand hovering over the doorknob. "This isn't my place." But then, another sob reached her ears, so full of anguish that Clara felt tears well up in her own eyes. Before she could think better of it, she raised her hand and knocked gently on the door. "Miss Emily?" she called softly. "Are you all right?" The crying stopped abruptly, replaced by a tense silence. Clara waited, her heart hammering in her chest, unsure of what would happen next. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity to Clara. She could feel her own pulse racing, her heart beating against her ribs as if it wanted to escape. The dark hallway seemed to close in around her, and for a moment she considered turning around and pretending that nothing had happened. "What am I doing?" she thought again, panic beginning to set in. "If Mr. Johnson finds out I'm meddling—" But before she could finish the thought, Emily's voice sounded from the other side of the door, trembling and uncertain. "Clara, is that you?" The young woman's voice was so fragile, so different from her usual confident tone, that Clara felt her heart tighten. Swallowing hard, she replied, "Yes, miss. I heard a noise and got worried. May I come in?" There was another moment of silence, then the soft sound of footsteps approaching. Clara held her breath, uncertain about what she would find on the other side of the door. Slowly, the doorknob turned and the door opened, revealing Emily. Clara had to hold back a gasp of surprise and concern. The young woman she always saw so well dressed with designer clothes and impeccable makeup now looked like a shadow of herself. Her long blonde hair, usually shiny and perfectly styled, was disheveled and lifeless. Her blue eyes, generally vibrant and full of life, were swollen and red, surrounded by dark circles that revealed sleepless nights. Emily wore a peach-colored silk pajama, wrinkled and stained with tears. Her thin arms were wrapped around herself, as if she were trying to protect herself from some invisible threat. The sight was so shocking that Clara felt her throat tighten. "Come in," Emily said, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Quick, before someone sees." Clara obeyed, slipping into the room and closing the door gently behind her. Emily's room was spacious and luxurious, decorated in shades of pink and white. A king-size bed dominated the center, covered with a silk bedspread and dozens of decorative pillows. On the walls, expensive paintings and ornate mirrors reflected the soft light of the lamps. The contrast between the room's luxury and Emily's emotional state was stark, making Clara feel even more out of place. Emily walked to the bed and sat on the edge, her shoulders slumped in a posture of defeat that Clara had never seen before. Clara stood near the door, uncertain about what to do or say. "Miss Emily," she began hesitantly, "what's going on? Is there something I can do to help?" Emily raised her eyes and Clara saw in them a mixture of fear, despair, and something else, relief. The young woman seemed to be struggling with herself, as if deciding whether or not to trust Clara. "Oh, Clara," Emily finally said, her voice breaking. "I don't know what to do. I can't bear it anymore." Clara felt a wave of compassion wash over her. Slowly, she approached and sat beside Emily on the bed. The soft mattress sank under their weight, and she felt the warmth of Emily's body next to hers, trembling slightly. "Tell me what's happening," Clara urged gently, resisting the impulse to put a comforting arm around Emily's shoulders. Despite the unusual situation, she was still conscious of the difference in status between them. "Maybe I can help." Emily took a deep breath, the sound trembling in the quiet room. When she spoke, her voice was low and filled with emotion. "It's my father. He wants me to get married." Clara frowned, confused. Marriage was usually a cause for celebration, especially in wealthy families like the Johnsons. Why was it causing Emily so much distress? "But isn't that supposed to be a good thing?" Clara asked cautiously. "A celebration?" Emily let out a bitter laugh, the sound echoing strangely in the luxurious room. The contrast between the laugh and the opulent surroundings made Clara shiver. "Not when the groom is chosen by my father just to strengthen his business," Emily said, her words dripping with bitterness. "The man is old enough to be my father, Clara, and I don't even know him." Clara felt as if she had been punched in the stomach. She had always known that Mr. Johnson was a ruthless businessman, but this was a level of cruelty she had not expected. "But miss," Clara said, trying to keep her voice calm despite the shock and indignation she felt. "Surely, Mr. Johnson can't force you to marry against your will. That's not legal." Emily shrugged, a gesture so defeated that it broke Clara's heart. "Legal or not, he will find a way," Emily said, her voice filled with resignation. "He always does." Clara was silent for a moment, absorbing the gravity of the situation. Her mind raced, trying to find a solution, a way out for Emily. "And your mother?" she asked, grasping at a thread of hope. "Can't she intervene?" Emily shook her head, fresh tears rolling down her pale cheeks. Clara had to resist the urge to wipe them away. "Mother is in Europe, on another of her shopping trips," Emily said, making air quotes with her fingers. The gesture seemed almost childish, reminding Clara of how young Emily really was. "But even if she were here, I doubt it would make a difference. She never opposes father." Clara felt a wave of anger rise within her. How could they do this to Emily? How could they treat her like a commodity to be traded? The young woman before her was a human being with dreams, desires, and the right to choose her own path in life. "Miss Emily," Clara said, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice, "this isn't right. We can't let this happen." Emily looked at her, surprised by the determination in her voice. For a moment, Clara saw a glimmer of hope in the young woman's blue eyes. "But what can we do?" Emily asked, a touch of hope coloring her voice for the first time since Clara had entered the room. Clara hesitated for a moment. What was she doing? She was just a maid with no power or influence. How could she help Emily stand up to someone as powerful as Mr. Johnson? But looking at Emily's young, frightened face, Clara felt a determination she hadn't known she possessed grow within her. She couldn't just stand by and let this injustice happen. With a gentle movement, Clara took Emily's hands in her own. She could feel the tremor that ran through the young woman's body, the fragility behind the facade of wealth and privilege. "I don't know yet," Clara admitted, her voice soft but firm. "But I promise I will help you. We will find a way out of this situation." Emily stared at her for a long moment, her blue eyes searching Clara's face. Then, slowly, a small smile appeared on her lips. It was fragile, hesitant, but it was there. "Thank you, Clara," she said softly. I don't know what I would do without you." Clara felt a lump form in her throat. She knew she was taking a risk, that she could lose her job, or worse, if Mr. Johnson found out. But looking at Emily, so young and scared, she knew she couldn't turn back. "We'll figure this out together," Clara promised, gently squeezing Emily's hands. "You're not alone, Miss Emily." The two women sat in silence for a moment, the air between them charged with a new understanding, a newly formed alliance. Outside, the night continued calm and peaceful, unaware of the drama unfolding within the walls of the Johnson mansion. Clara knew that the coming days would be challenging. They would have to be careful, smart, and brave. But looking at Emily, seeing the spark of hope now shining in her eyes, Clara felt a fierce determination growing within her. "No matter what happens," she thought, "I will protect Emily. I will help her find her freedom." As the days passed, the tension grew quietly in the mansion. Clara, with a newfound sharp awareness, walked through the luxurious corridors as if seeing them for the first time. Her keen eyes picked up on details previously ignored, and the grandeur of the house, once admired, now seemed oppressive with the weight of unrevealed secrets. It was as if the very walls whispered dark stories, audible only to those who dared to listen. One particularly cold morning, Clara was cleaning Mr. Johnson's office. The rich aroma of leather and polished wood filled the air, mingling with the sharp smell of whiskey forgotten in a glass on the desk. She moved silently around the room, the cleaning cloth sliding over shiny surfaces. How much money was spent here, she thought, observing the expensive objects decorating the office. And at what cost? As she dusted a shelf of leather-bound books, Clara noticed something strange. One of the volumes seemed slightly out of place. Curious, she gently pulled it. To her surprise, the book didn't move. Instead, there was a soft click, and an entire section of the shelf slid aside, revealing a secret compartment. Clara's heart raced. "This can't be good," she thought, nervously glancing at the closed office door. She knew she shouldn't pry, but something inside her compelled her to investigate. With trembling hands, she took a leather folder from the compartment. Opening it, her eyes widened in shock. Before her were documents detailing complex financial transactions, names of prominent politicians, and astronomical figures. Clara wasn't an expert in finance, but even she could see something was wrong. The words offshore, money laundering, and bribery jumped off the pages, making her stomach churn. My God, she thought, horror growing inside her. Mr. Johnson is involved in illegal activities, and on a scale I can't even imagine. Suddenly, Clara heard footsteps approaching the office. Panicking, she quickly replaced the folder in the compartment and closed the secret shelf. She barely had time to return to her cleaning position when the door opened. Mr. Johnson entered, his cold eyes sweeping the room before fixing on Clara. She felt a chill run down her spine. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice sharp as ice. Clara forced a smile, praying her face wouldn't betray her nerves. "Just the routine cleaning, sir," she replied, holding up the duster as proof. Johnson stared at her for a long moment, his piercing eyes seeming to read her thoughts. Clara felt sweat beads form on her forehead. "Very well," he finally said. "Finish quickly and leave. I have work to do." "Yes, sir," Clara murmured, hastening to complete her tasks. When she finally left the office, her legs were trembling. She leaned against the hallway wall, taking deep breaths to calm herself. "What have I just discovered?" she thought, a mix of fear and disbelief swirling in her chest. "And what should I do with this information?" That night, after the house had fallen silent, Clara sneaked into Emily's room. She found the young woman sitting on the bed, an open book in her lap, but her eyes were distant, lost in thought. "Miss Emily?" Clara called softly. Emily started, but upon seeing Clara, her shoulders visibly relaxed. "Oh, Clara, please come in." Clara closed the door quietly behind her and approached the bed. The room was lit only by a bedside lamp, casting soft shadows on the walls. I need to tell you something," Clara said, sitting on the edge of the bed. Her voice trembled slightly as she recounted her discovery in the office. As Clara spoke, Emily's eyes widened, a mix of fear and resignation crossing her face. "I always knew my father did questionable things," Emily said when Clara finished. Her voice was low, almost a whisper, "but I never imagined it was this serious." Clara watched the young woman with concern. "Miss Emily, how long has this been going on? Your father's control, I mean." Emily sighed, running a hand through her hair in a gesture of frustration. "For as long as I can remember, my father has always controlled every aspect of my life. What I wear, who I talk to, where I go. Even my studies were chosen by him." Clara felt her heart ache. "And your mother? She never intervened." Emily let out a bitter laugh. "My mother is more concerned with her shopping and parties than with me. She pretends not to see what's happening right under her nose." Silence fell between them, heavy and oppressive. Clara could feel the fear emanating from Emily in almost tangible waves. "I'm scared, Clara," Emily admitted finally, her voice breaking. "I'm scared of what my father will do if I refuse to marry. I'm scared of what he'll do if he finds out we know about his illegal dealings." Clara felt a surge of protectiveness rise within her. Without thinking, she took Emily's hands in hers. "I won't let anything happen to you," she promised, her voice firm despite the fear she felt. "We'll find a way out of this situation." Emily looked at her, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "How?" "My father is powerful, Clara. He has connections everywhere." Clara took a deep breath, her mind racing with possibilities. Maybe we can use what we've discovered against him. If we have proof of his illegal activities." "Are you suggesting we blackmail my father?" Emily asked, a mix of shock and admiration in her voice. Clara shook her head. "Not exactly, but if we have evidence, we can threaten to expose him if he doesn't leave you alone." Emily was silent for a moment, considering the idea. "It's dangerous," she said finally. "If we get caught." "I know," Clara agreed, "but we can't just stand by and let this continue. You deserve to be free, Miss Emily. You deserve to live your own life." The two women looked at each other, a silent understanding passing between them. The room seemed to vibrate with the tension of the decision they were making. "Okay," Emily said finally, a spark of determination in her eyes. "Let's do it. Together." Clara nodded, feeling a mix of fear and excitement. She knew they were taking a risk, that the consequences could be terrible if they were discovered. But looking at Emily, seeing the hope beginning to shine in her eyes, she knew she had no choice. "I will protect her," Clara promised silently, "no matter the cost." The sun had barely risen when Clara woke up, her body tense with the anxiety of what she was about to do. She got up silently, dressing carefully so as not to make any noise. The maid's room seemed smaller than ever, the walls almost suffocating with the weight of the secrets she now kept. "It's today," she thought, her heart racing. "Today, we start our fight against Mr. Johnson." Clara left the room, her steps soft in the dark corridor. The mansion still slept, but she knew it wouldn't for long. She had to act quickly. Arriving in the kitchen, Clara began her usual routine, preparing the elaborate breakfast Mr. Johnson demanded every morning. Her hands trembled slightly as she cracked the eggs, the rich smell of freshly ground coffee filling the air. "Stay calm," she told herself. "Act normal." As she worked, her mind reviewed the plan she and Emily had devised the night before. It was risky, even dangerous, but it was their only chance. The sound of heavy footsteps pulled her from her thoughts. Peter, the gardener, entered the kitchen, his face marked by fatigue and something else. Fear? "Good morning, Clara," he said, his voice low and tense. Clara watched him for a moment. Peter had always been quiet, keeping to himself, but in the past few days she had noticed something different about him, a restlessness, a furtive look that intrigued her. "Good morning, Peter," she replied hesitantly. "Is everything all right?" Peter looked around as if checking if they were truly alone. Then, to Clara's surprise, he approached, his voice almost a whisper. "Clara, I need to talk to you. It's important." Clara felt her heart speed up. What could Peter want? Did he know something about her plans with Emily? "What is it, Peter?" she asked, trying to keep her voice calm. Peter took a deep breath, his eyes meeting Clara's with an intensity that surprised her. "I know what Mr. Johnson is doing," he said, "and I know you and Miss Emily are planning something against him." Clara felt the blood freeze in her veins. How did Peter know? Was he going to report them? "Peter, I don't know what you're talking about," she began, but Peter interrupted her with a gesture. "Don't lie to me, Clara. I saw you two talking in the garden last night, and I want to help." Clara was speechless for a moment, studying Peter's face. There was determination in his eyes, but also fear and hope. "Why?" she finally asked. "Why do you want to help us?" Peter looked at his calloused hands, his voice trembling slightly as he spoke. "Because Mr. Johnson isn't just cruel to his daughter. He's been blackmailing me for years. He threatened to deport my family if I didn't do exactly what he said. I can't take it anymore, Clara. I can't live like this." Clara felt a wave of compassion and understanding wash over her. She reached out, gently touching Peter's arm. "Oh, Peter," she said softly. "I'm sorry. I didn't know." Peter raised his eyes, a sad smile on his lips. No one knew. That was the point. But now we have a chance to stop him. Together. Clara nodded slowly, her mind racing with possibilities. With Peter on their side, their chances of success increased significantly. "All right," she said finally, "let's talk to Emily. Together, we can come up with a better plan." That night, after everyone in the mansion had gone to bed, Clara, Emily, and Peter gathered in Emily's room. The tension in the air was palpable, three people united by a common goal but still uncertain about how to proceed. Emily looked at Peter with a mix of surprise and caution. "Are you sure we can trust him?" she whispered to Clara. Clara nodded. "He's as trapped in this situation as we are, Emily, and with his help, we have a much better chance." Emily took a deep breath, then turned to Peter. "All right," she said. "What do you suggest?" Peter leaned forward, his voice low but firm. "Mr. Johnson keeps a safe in his office," he began. "I saw him open it once when he thought he was alone. Inside, there were folders and a hard drive. I bet that's where he keeps all the evidence of his illegal activities." Clara and Emily exchanged glances. This could be exactly what they needed. "But how are we going to get into the office?" Clara asked. "He always keeps it locked." It was then that Emily smiled, a determined glint in her eyes. "Leave that to me," she said. "I can create a distraction, something to get my father out of the office long enough for you to get in." Clara felt a chill of apprehension. "Emily, are you sure? If your father finds out—" Emily cut her off with a firm gesture. "I'm tired of being afraid of him, Clara. It's time we fight back." Peter nodded, a smile of admiration on his face. "You're brave, Miss Emily, but we need to be careful. If we get caught—" "We won't," Emily said firmly. "We'll plan every detail. We can't afford to fail." The three of them spent the next few hours devising their plan. Every move, every possible obstacle was discussed and resolved. By the time they finished, the sun was already beginning to rise, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Clara looked out the window, feeling a mix of fear and anticipation. In a few days, they would put their plan into action. It was risky, dangerous, but it was their only chance to free Emily and expose Mr. Johnson's crimes. God help us, Clara thought, her heart heavy with the weight of responsibility. As the three of them parted, each going to their respective rooms, Clara couldn't help but feel that something had changed irrevocably. They were no longer just employees and mistress. They were conspirators, united by a common goal and a dangerous secret. The clock on the wall read 5:30 a.m. In a few hours, the mansion would awaken to another seemingly normal day. But beneath the surface, a revolution was about to begin. Clara lay down in her bed, exhausted but unable to sleep. Her mind replayed every detail of the plan, every possible failure. "We will succeed," she told herself, trying to believe her own words. "We have to succeed." Just as Clara finally managed to close her eyes and sleep, she was brutally torn from her slumber by violent knocks on her door. Her heart instantly raced, adrenaline flooding her system before she could even fully open her eyes. "Open the door right now!" Marcus's deep, threatening voice reverberated through the wood. He was Mr. Johnson's head of security. Clara jumped out of bed, her bare feet touching the cold floor. Her hands trembled as she hastily put on her robe over her nightgown. They found out, she thought, panic threatening to engulf her. Oh God, what are we going to do now? With one last shaky breath to calm herself, Clara opened the door. Marcus, a burly man with a perpetually furrowed face, glared at her with cold eyes. "Mr. Johnson wants to see you. Now," he growled, grabbing Clara's arm with enough force to leave marks. Clara had no choice but to follow him, practically being dragged through the mansion's corridors. Her thoughts raced frantically. Emily, Peter, where are they? Have they been discovered too? Mr. Johnson's office was an imposing room decorated with dark woods and leather furniture. Johnson himself stood behind his massive desk, his face a mask of contained fury. Beside him, Emily sat in a chair, pale and trembling. "Leave us," Johnson ordered Marcus, who exited, closing the door behind him. The ensuing silence was heavy, loaded with tension. Clara could hear her own heart pounding furiously in her ears. "So," Johnson began, his voice dangerously calm, "it seems we have a spy in our house." Clara swallowed hard, trying to maintain her composure. "Sir, I don't know what you're talking about." Johnson laughed, a humorless sound that made Clara shiver. "Don't insult my intelligence, Clara. I know exactly what you, my ungrateful daughter, and that incompetent gardener have been doing." He picked up a folder from his desk and threw it towards Clara. Photos scattered across the floor. Clara and Emily talking in hidden corners of the mansion. Peter handing documents to Clara, the three of them meeting in the garden late at night. "You really thought you could deceive me?" Johnson snarled, his calm facade crumbling. "That you could meddle in my business and get away with it?" Clara felt fear rising inside her, but when she looked at Emily and saw the terror in the young woman's eyes, it filled her with a courage she didn't know she possessed. "What you're doing is wrong," Clara said, her voice trembling slightly but firm. "You can't force your daughter to marry against her will, and your business transactions? They're illegal, and you know it." Johnson rounded the desk, approaching Clara with threatening steps. "You don't know anything," he hissed. "Who do you think you are to judge my actions? You're nothing but an insignificant maid." Clara took a step back but stood her ground. "I may be just a maid, Mr. Johnson, but I know the difference between right and wrong, and what you're doing is wrong." Johnson laughed again, the sound cold and cruel. "And what do you plan to do about it? Report me? No one would believe you. It was then that Clara played her trump card. With her heart pounding furiously, she took a small USB device from the pocket of her robe. Maybe they won't believe me, she said, holding up the device, but they will believe the evidence I have here. Johnson's face visibly paled. What is that? He asked, his voice betraying a hint of fear for the first time. Copies of all your incriminating documents, Clara replied. Illegal contracts, records of bribes, evidence of your blackmail. It's all here. Johnson lunged forward, trying to grab the device, but Clara was faster, stepping back. Don't even think about it, she warned. There are copies. If anything happens to me or Emily, this information goes straight to the authorities. Johnson's face contorted in a mask of rage. For a moment, Clara feared he might physically attack her. But then, something in his eyes changed. It was a look Clara knew well, the look of a man calculating his options. What do you want? He finally asked, his voice a low growl. Clara took a deep breath, gathering all her courage. I want you to leave Emily alone. Cancel this ridiculous marriage and let her live her own life. And I want you to stop your illegal activities. Johnson laughed bitterly. You ask for a lot, don't you? No, Emily intervened, surprising everyone as she stood up. Her voice trembled, but there was a determination in her eyes that Clara had never seen before. She's not asking for a lot, Father. She's asking for what's right. Johnson looked at his daughter, a mix of anger and something else in his eyes. Regret? Shame? Clara wasn't sure. And if I refuse? He asked, turning back to Clara. Clara raised her chin, meeting Johnson's gaze without wavering. Then this information goes public. Your reputation, your business, everything will be ruined. The silence that followed was tense, loaded with possibilities. Clara could feel her heart hammering against her ribs, sweat trickling down her back. She had played all her cards. Now all that remained was to wait. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Johnson let out a defeated sigh. Very well, he said, his voice tired. You win. The marriage is off. Emily let out a small sob of relief, running to hug Clara. Johnson watched them with an unreadable expression. But don't think this is over, he warned. You two have 24 hours to get out of this house, and if I hear even a word about my business leaking out... The threat hung in the air, unspoken but clearly understood. Clara nodded, holding Emily protectively. Understood, she said. We'll be gone by tomorrow. As they left the office, Clara felt a mix of relief and fear. They had secured Emily's freedom, but at what cost? Where would they go now? It doesn't matter, Clara thought, looking at Emily's relieved face. The important thing is that we're together and free. As they hurried back to their rooms to pack, Clara knew the future was uncertain. But for the first time in a long time, it was a future full of possibilities, a future they could shape with their own hands. And that, Clara thought with a smile, was worth any risk. The clock at the Johnson mansion struck midnight, each chime echoing like a gunshot in the silence of the night. Clara, her heart pounding against her ribs, peeked out of the small window in her maid's quarters. The full moon hung high in the sky, bathing the meticulously kept gardens in an ethereal silver light. It's now or never, she thought, swallowing hard. God help us. With silent movements born of years of practice, Clara picked up the small backpack she had prepared and left her room. The service corridor was dark and quiet, but each step she took seemed deafening to her hypersensitive ears. Reaching Emily's room, she knocked softly on the door, 3 times in quick succession, the agreed signal. The door opened almost instantly, revealing Emily. The young woman was pale, her blue eyes wide with fear and excitement. "Are you ready?" Clara whispered. Emily nodded, clutching a small bag. "Yes," she replied, her voice trembling slightly. "Let's go before I lose my nerve." The two women moved silently through the mansion's corridors, every shadow seeming like a threat, every creak of the floorboards an alarm about to sound. Clara could feel Emily's tremors beside her, the young woman's fear almost palpable. "Take a deep breath," Clara told herself. "Stay calm. For Emily." Finally, they reached the back door of the kitchen. Clara opened it carefully, grateful for the meticulous maintenance that prevented any revealing creaks. The cold night air hit them, carrying the scent of freshly cut grass and blooming roses. Peter, the gardener, waited for them in the shadows beside an old Ford Escort. His usually jovial face was tense, his dark eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. "Hurry," he whispered, opening the car door. "We need to get out of here before anyone notices." Clara helped Emily into the back seat, then slid into the passenger seat. Peter started the engine, the sound seeming deafening in the night. As the car slowly pulled away from the mansion, Clara couldn't help but look back. The imposing structure that had been her home and prison for so many years shrank in the distance, its dark windows seeming like empty eyes watching their escape. "Goodbye," she thought, a mix of relief and apprehension settling in her chest. "God forgive us for what we're doing." The car had just passed through the property's gates when the unthinkable happened. Lights turned on in the mansion, and the distant sound of raised voices reached their ears. "Damn it!" Peter cursed, flooring the accelerator. "They've found out!" The old Ford roared in protest but obeyed, gaining speed. Clara turned to look out the back window, her heart almost stopping as she saw two black SUVs speeding out of the mansion's garage. "They're coming after us!" she shouted, panic coloring her voice. Emily let out a frightened sob in the back seat. "Oh God," she murmured repeatedly, her hands gripping the seat so tightly her knuckles turned white. Peter cursed again, maneuvering the car skillfully through the deserted city streets. The Ford groaned and shook, clearly not used to such abuse. "Hold on!" Peter shouted, making a sharp turn at high speed. Clara was thrown against the door, feeling the impact resonate through her body. The SUVs were gaining ground, their high beams illuminating the Ford's interior. Clara could see Emily's terrified face in the back seat, silent tears streaming down her cheeks. "Peter, do something!" Clara pleaded, desperation taking over her. Peter nodded, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. "There's a shortcut just after that bend," he said, his voice tense. "If we can get there without them seeing." He left the sentence unfinished, but Clara understood. It was their only chance. The Ford skidded around the bend, the tires squealing in protest. For one terrible moment, Clara thought they would flip. But then the car straightened, and Peter turned sharply onto an almost invisible dirt road. The headlights were turned off, leaving them in near total darkness. Clara could hear her own ragged breathing, mixed with Emily's muffled sobs and Peter's heavy breathing. The Ford bounced violently on the bumpy road, but Peter kept control with a steely determination. Behind them, Clara could hear the roar of the SUV engines passing by on the main road. "I think we lost them," Peter said after a few tense minutes, his voice still filled with adrenaline. Clara let out a shaky sigh, feeling relief flood her body. She turned to Emily, who was curled up in the back seat, her eyes wide with fear. "It's okay now, Miss Emily," Clara said softly, reaching out to touch the young woman's knee. "We're safe." Emily nodded slowly, tears still streaming down her face. I can't believe we actually did it," she whispered. Peter slowed the car, allowing the Ford to navigate more smoothly along the dirt road. "I know a place where we can hide for a while," he said, A small town a few hours from here. I have a friend there who can help us." Clara nodded, feeling exhaustion begin to set in now that the adrenaline was wearing off. "Thank you, Peter," she said sincerely. "We wouldn't have made it without you." Peter shrugged, but Clara could see a small smile on his lips. "Hey, someone had to help you two get out of that hellhole," he said. The following hours passed in a blur of dark roads and whispered conversations. Emily eventually fell asleep in the back seat, the stress and exhaustion finally overcoming her. As the sun began to rise on the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange, they reached a small town. The streets were deserted, the shops still closed. Peter drove to a small house on the outskirts of town, parking the tired car in the driveway. "We're here," he announced, turning off the engine. Clara gently woke Emily, who blinked in confusion for a moment before remembering where she was. A small smile formed on her lips. "Are we really free?" she asked, her voice filled with a mix of disbelief and hope. Clara smiled back, feeling a wave of emotion wash over her. "Yes, Miss Emily," she replied. "We are free." As they got out of the car, the first rays of sunlight touched their faces. Clara closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the warmth on her skin. When she opened them again, she saw Emily doing the same, a look of pure joy on her face. This is just the beginning, Clara thought, watching Emily breathe in the fresh morning air. But it's a new beginning, a free beginning. Peter was already at the door of the house, talking to a middle-aged man whom Clara assumed was his friend. She grabbed her backpack and Emily's bag, then extended her hand to the young woman. "Shall we?" she asked softly. Emily nodded, taking Clara's hand. Together they walked towards the house, leaving behind the darkness of the night and the shadows of the past. The future was uncertain, Clara knew that. They still had a long road ahead. But looking at Emily, seeing the hope and determination in her eyes, Clara felt a wave of optimism. No matter what comes, she thought, we will face it together. The next day, the rising sun painted the sky with shades of pink and orange as Clara and Emily arrived at the police station. The red brick building looked imposing and a bit intimidating in the morning light. Clara felt Emily tremble beside her and gently squeezed her hand. "It's okay," Clara murmured, her voice low but firm. "We're doing the right thing." Emily nodded, taking a deep breath. Her blue eyes, though tired from the dramatic escape, shone with a determination Clara had never seen before. How she's grown, Clara thought, a mix of pride and sadness filling her chest. Such a shame it had to be this way. Together, they climbed the stone steps and entered the building. The interior was cold and austere, smelling of stale coffee and paper. A policeman sitting behind a counter looked up as they approached. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice neutral, but his eyes keenly assessing the two women in front of him. Clara cleared her throat, feeling it dry. "Yes," she said, her voice firmer than she felt. We have information about illegal activities. We'd like to speak with someone." The policeman frowned, his eyes narrowing slightly. "What kind of illegal activities?" Emily stepped forward, her voice trembling slightly but gaining strength as she spoke. "Fraud, blackmail, possible influence peddling. We have evidence." The policeman stared at them for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Wait here," he said, standing up. "I'll get the duty detective." As they waited, Clara looked at Emily. The young woman appeared pale but determined. Clara felt a wave of pride and protectiveness. Whatever happens, Clara thought, I'll be by her side. The detective who came to meet them was a middle-aged man with sharp eyes and a face etched with worry lines. He led them to a small, windowless interrogation room, the air heavy with the smell of disinfectant. "I'm Detective Ramirez," he said, sitting at the metal table and indicating the chairs across from him for Clara and Emily. "I understand you have information about illegal activities." Emily nodded, her voice low but firm. "Yes, about my father, Charles Johnson." The detective's eyes widened slightly at the name, but he maintained his professional composure. "The businessman? I see. Please, tell me everything." Over the next few hours, Emily and Clara shared everything they knew. Emily spoke about her father's oppressive control, the veiled threats, the forced marriage. Clara presented the documents she had found, detailing suspicious transactions and blackmail schemes. Detective Ramirez listened intently, taking notes and occasionally asking questions. His face remained impassive, but Clara could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes narrowed as the gravity of the situation became clear. By the time they finished, the sun was high in the sky. Clara felt exhausted, as if she had run a marathon. Looking at Emily, she saw that the young woman seemed equally spent, but there was a glimmer of relief in her eyes. Detective Ramirez leaned back in his chair, letting out a long sigh. "Ladies," he said, his voice grave, "what you've brought me is, well, it's explosive. It will take time to investigate everything, but I can assure you we will take this very seriously." Emily nodded, tears of relief glistening in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. Clara placed a comforting hand on Emily's shoulder. "What happens now?" she asked the detective. "Now," Ramirez said, "we need to ensure your safety. We'll place you in a witness protection program until the investigation is concluded." The following weeks were a whirlwind. Clara and Emily were taken to a safe house where they spent their days watching the news unfold on television. The arrest of Charles Johnson shocked the business world, headlines screaming about the fallen empire. Emily cried when she saw her father being led away in handcuffs, but Clara noticed that the tears were more of relief than sadness. "It's over," Emily whispered, her voice choked. "It's really over." Clara hugged her, feeling the young woman's body tremble against hers. "Yes," she said softly, "you're free now." As the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, Clara watched Emily blossom. The timid, frightened girl she had known in the Johnson mansion disappeared, replaced by a confident, determined woman. Emily decided to use her inheritance, what remained after the investigations, to create a foundation supporting victims of domestic abuse and human trafficking. Clara, moved by the cause, volunteered to help. "Do you really want to do this?" Emily asked, her eyes shining with hope and affection. "You don't have to, you know. You've already done so much for me." Clara smiled, taking Emily's hands in hers. "I want to," she said firmly. "After everything we've been through, I feel like I've found my purpose." Emily hugged her, tears of happiness streaming down her cheeks. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." Months turned into years. The New Hope Foundation, created by Emily and Clara, grew and thrived. They worked side by side, helping women and children escape abusive situations, offering legal, psychological, and financial support. One sunny afternoon, 5 years after that fateful night at the Johnson mansion, Clara and Emily were sitting in the garden of the foundation's headquarters. The air was scented with the aroma of roses and jasmine, and the soft sound of a nearby fountain created a peaceful atmosphere. Emily looked at Clara, a gentle smile on her lips. "You know," she said, "sometimes I still can't believe everything that happened, how my life changed, how I changed." Clara nodded, feeling a wave of affection for the young woman who had become like a daughter to her. "You're amazing, Emily," she said softly. "You always were. You just needed the chance to shine." Emily took Clara's hand, squeezing it gently. "And you gave me that chance," she said, her voice full of emotion. You risked everything for me. I'll never forget that." Clara felt tears well up in her eyes. "It was worth it," she said, her voice choked. "Every moment." They sat in silence for a moment, enjoying the peace of the garden and the strength of the bond between them. Clara looked up at the blue sky, feeling a sense of contentment she had never experienced before. "Who would have thought," she reflected, "that helping someone would help me find my own path?" The sound of animated voices drew them from their thoughts. A group of women was arriving for the afternoon group therapy session. Emily stood up, extending a hand to Clara. "Ready for another day of work?" she asked, her eyes shining with determination and compassion. Clara smiled, taking Emily's hand and standing up. "Always," she replied. Together, they walked toward the foundation's building, ready to face another day of challenges and hopes. The sun shone down on them like a promise of better days to come. Clara and Emily continued their journey, no longer as employer and employee, but as friends, partners, and chosen family. United by adversity, strengthened by determination, and inspired by hope, they moved forward, making a difference one life at a time. The future, once so uncertain and frightening, now gleamed with infinite possibilities. And though they knew there would be challenges ahead, Clara and Emily were ready to face them. Together,